Here's another tip, which is meet your set-asides. Now that shouldn't even have to be a tip, right? That's one of the most fundamental things about the SHIP program. There's only a couple of rules. I mean, the SHIP program is not like, you know, some sort of federal housing program manual that's, you know, so thick you could use it as a doorstop. It's relatively small, and the SHIP program is relatively flexible. And yet there's no getting around the set-asides. So let's talk about those set-asides a little bit. I made reference to the income set-aside a little earlier, and I will on the next slide too. But first, let's talk about the home ownership and the construction rehab set-asides. Those are two set-asides there. Now, let's recognize that, well, who can tell me what the home ownership set-aside is? Define that for me. Yeah, Tetra.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead and do it. Nobody else is volunteering.
Oh, come on. No, the set-aside is that for home ownership, 65% of your distribution must go toward a home ownership activity.
65% of what money specifically? Not quite. It's not just the SHIP monies. It's actually, more specifically, this is a little tricky, but it's important. It's 65% of your, so we're going to see, this is the home ownership set-aside. And that is 65% of distribution plus recaptured funds. Just those two sources of revenue. Can anybody give me an example of another source of revenue besides those two? Program interest or program income, right? Yeah. Is there anything else? Another source of revenue? Carry forward is another source of revenue. Talk about that in a minute. But so the home ownership set aside, that's interesting. 65% of distribution plus recaptured funds must be used for home ownership activities. And now, in some communities, especially the communities I've most recently been working in, everything they do meets the home ownership set aside. They help people repair houses, they help people buy new houses. Those are both home ownership activities. Give me an example of a non-home ownership activity we can spend. Okay, that's right, you're doing, I was just asking you a little earlier. You use some of your SHIP money in your county to help build new rental units. Rental units, you don't own those. Or similarly, maybe a homeless shelter. If you were to partially finance a homeless shelter with SHIP dollars, people don't own those beds. They don't even actually rent there. In that case, it's a non-home ownership project. It's not really like people at a homeless shelter are renting the beds for a certain amount of money per night or something like that. But that's an example of a non-home ownership activity. And so that would have to fall outside of this 65% quota. Now let's do the math here. 65% of your money has to be used for home ownership, but then you're probably going to want to set aside 10% of your money for your admin budget, right? 65 plus 10, now we're up to 75%. That means only 25% of your remaining funds could be used for something non-home ownership related. That would be the pot of money that Mildred in Broward County, for example, is devoting to a rental project. Or where another community, or Waialae Osceola County, for example, is thinking about building that homeless shelter. That's where I thought about that example. You'd only be able to do that out of a smaller portion of your SHIP money. My point on this slide that I want to make is to remind you that whenever you're making those sorts of decisions about how much money you're going to devote to non-home ownership housing, those are usually decisions that you sit around, consciously make towards the beginning time when you first receive that money. You have to be real conscious about that sort of thing, because usually non-home ownership projects are big projects. They're usually not, give me $3,000 to fix up this rental unit. It's more often, give me $50,000 per unit to build 20 units as part of this 100-unit rental complex over here. You know, it's a big chunk of money. And so you're usually making decisions about any big chunks of money that you're going to give people consciously and towards the beginning part of all the work that you're doing to spend a certain distribution of money. The home ownership set aside a real fundamental part of our SHIP program. A lot of people think that housing counseling counts towards the home ownership set aside, but it doesn't. It seems a little counterintuitive, but let's talk about that. When I say housing counseling, I'm talking about the amount of money that your community may budget. It's very often an amount of money that's above and beyond the 10% admin budget, okay? And this is the money that they use to help provide people with one-on-one housing counseling, or maybe classes. It's very common that there's classes to help home buyers or whatever. And so that is real legitimate money to spend. It really does help people, giving people education and informing them of how to buy a house. That's all very helpful. But it doesn't meet the home ownership set aside. As it turns out, providing people with education about how to successfully buy a house is not the same thing as actually providing cash money to help them buy this house over there, right? That specific house over there. And so general education on how to buy a house doesn't count towards the home ownership set aside. Just a bit